Queens. They've got an incredible conservation department there, and so he must be one of the best in the world if he's being given that job. Come on, why are you not doing what I'm asking you to do? So anyway, we're moving right along, and this is this marvelous thing called the Madonna with Chancellor Rolin, R-O-L-I-N, and again that's one of your capital letters on your highlight sheet. Down about 1433, not signed or dated.
14, sorry?
About 1433. So basically right after the Gendorf. And as you can imagine, that was sort of 6 years probably of hard labour to create that whole complex. So now you're back working on sort of private commissions basically. About 26 inches high, which is not big at all. And it's in the Louvre in Paris. And I did flash that up again just briefly, not because I'm so wonderful, although I am. And when you see my hand blurred like that means I'm talking really fast. But just to give you an idea of scale, because it's tiny, and yet the amount of detail, the amount of information in it really is quite amazing. So what we're looking at is, again, this fellow, this is Chancellor Nicolas Rolin, and again I mentioned him in passing in the first lecture because he is really a good example of the new rich, the self-made men, rather than inherited wealth, the titles and the lands and all of the aristocratic qualities. These are people who kind of work hard to bring themselves up. And he ended up as being the chief administrator, basically, for the Duke of Burgundy, which, remember, at that time was as strong as France and sort of Germany on the other side. He's an enormously powerful man who was basically the tax collector to keep the Duke well financed. But as most tax collectors do, it was a lot of it sort of went into his pocket. And I mentioned the fact, in fact, we'll see it next time. The poor house that he built in a town called Beaune, B-E-A-U-N-E. But as was said about him, if it hadn't been for him bleeding everybody dry, they wouldn't have needed a poor house. So again, it was this thing. But also it's the idea of, I mentioned this as well, of what even like with Joost Weidt and the Gendolderbys, commissioning, paying for beautiful things to ease your passage into heaven. And with Joost Weidt, his father had been caught with his hand in the till, basically, because he had a similar job to Rolin. It was probably a setup, basically, as sort of political power was changing. They kind of nailed all the people from the previous administration. But even so, you have to do the good deeds too. Same with, I mentioned this, I think, the famous Giotto chapel in Padua. That was a fellow also trying to get his father out of purgatory by having this beautiful building created. So he's an important man, so he chooses to have himself immortalized like this. He's in his late 50s at this point. You can see he's kneeling. This thing here is called a prie-dieu, basically a sort of prayer stool. And you put your book on it and you kneel there, presumably on a nice comfy cushion, and you say your prayers. And so here he is. Remember, I mentioned that this area is so important for the textile industry, so all of the materials that he wears, the embroidered robes and the fur-lined collars and things, quite absolutely wonderful. The bad hairdo, I've never quite figured that one out, because that's not good at all. But this, I mentioned this before, the mapping of the face, every vein, every wrinkle, the sort of plug-ugly, and the realism, the plug-ugly quality of the guy. There's no attempt whatsoever to make him look handsome and innocent somehow. So that kind of attention to detail is very important. And he kneels, even the book itself in front of him is so beautifully done. I'll forget to point them out later. Peacocks. Peacocks were believed, they symbolized eternity. It was believed that a peacock's flesh never decayed after it died, so it was, I mean, it does, but they thought it didn't, so it becomes a symbol of eternity. Also angels wear peacock feather wings, if you check them out. So there he is, praying away like mad. Across from him is the Madonna and Child, the Madonna and Child. And she almost literally takes a kind of back seat to him. So she's not nearly as fancifully dressed as usual, rather solidly placed, kind of sitting back, holding the Christ child out. And she then becomes this this is what we saw before, really, the Sede Sapientiae, the throne of wisdom. And it's all to do with Solomon in the Old Testament, all of these ideas that trickle down. And he just sits there on the job, basically going bless, bless, holding this wonderful bejeweled orb, which is a symbol of earthly. But the kings have orbs and scepters, the sort of tools of their royal power. That's what we saw. Some of those are those magpies. We saw some of those before. And lilies, roses. Lilies and roses are all symbols of Mary, Mary's purity, that sort of stuff. So there's nothing that doesn't have that kind of secondary meaning. Just while these two are up, there's been about 83 suggestions of who they might be. And to be honest, I think they're there just to show that we're high up, as if we didn't know already. Because this is another of those things where we saw last time with the elevated space from the Merrow Dolphin, all you can see out the window were clouds. Other ones, you're high up because Mary is kind of elevated in every sense into this kind of spiritual area, which might mean, you're not quite sure if it means that, is he praying away like mad, so the Madonna and Child have kind of miraculously become a sort of visionary form created in front of him, or are we in her kind of divine space, and he's been transported into that through the power of prayer? Don't know. It could be either in a way. But it's interesting that there's no real sense of intimacy between the two. He's kind of distant and lost in thought. I think he's counting his money, to be honest. It just has no sense of religiosity or spirituality whatsoever. But again, it's this amazing thing, and this very tough-looking little Christ child. I can't remember if I mentioned that, but more in Italy than in the north. But again, remember, Jan Monak seems to be better educated than most northern artists. The connection back to Greek mythology, because little baby Heracles, his stepmother, if that's the right word, sent serpents to kill him and his little brother in the crib. And because he's the god of muscles, he strangles the serpent. It's quite a popular theme in art. So his physical strength equals Christ's spiritual strength, so the one equals the other, basically. So that's why he's sometimes shown as this little tough guy. Because he's not terribly Jewish at all, is he? He's got little curly blonde hair. And, there's an interesting sort of racial cleansing, you might say, to create an image of Christ who's sort of rather in denial. Because Christians didn't really like to admit that Christ was Jewish. Kind of screwed up their whole idea to a certain extent. Anyway, so here we are. And Mary, not crowned for once, but there's a handy angel with a crown, just in case she needs one, just to remind us that she's Queen of Heaven. And again, there's the two looking down there. Now, I'm not sure which one is the best to zoom in on, because it really is. When you're in the Louvre, and you all will be before too long, I hope, you just literally have to press your nose up against this, because even take a magnifying glass, because it's just, you cannot believe the amount of stuff that's going on. And there are little boats in the water, the reflections of, that's a lovely little bit, the reflections of it's almost Asian, if you think of some Japanese prints by Hokusai, people like that, of bridges over water. And there are little people trudging across the bridge there. They're sort of fortified city gates, basically. Then there's little boats with reflections and people paddling, a little ferry boat, I guess, going across, a little tiny island with a castle on it. On and on and on. And again, none of that makes it good art, I suppose, but it's really kind of nice to look at it all. And don't forget, I said last time that Van Eyck probably, as an early part of his career, illuminated a manuscript, so that really gets you used to the idea of sort of one hair on a brush, basically, to create this tiny detail. And the buildings here, particularly in behind Christ, you can see there's a very large church and all the other things. So people have tried to, so realistic looking, to identify as Bruges, Liège, Utrecht, Lyon, Brussels, even Prague. So in other words, they want to pin it down. I said that last time, that for some reason everybody wants to kind of pin things down and be specific about things. I don't think it is at all. If he wanted us to know where it was, he'd have put up a big signboard, someone saying, "Welcome to Prague," or something like that. He doesn't. So I think this becomes more sort of the earthly city of, or maybe even the heavenly city of Jerusalem. It's sort of their home in behind, a sort of paradise on earth almost. And that would become this wonderful there's nothing like a meandering river. We saw the road in one of those compound pictures going back into but that pulls your eye back into space. But you've still got this fairly kind of codifying of the browns to greens to blues to grey, sort of sucking you back into space as well, which is rather nicely done. So what you get is this amazing mix of the telescopic, because you can see for bloody miles, and the microscopic, because every tiny detail of the flowers and things in the foreground, that's there as well. It's really quite extraordinary. And I'm not sure, can you see just above the bad hairdo? Because, well, first of all, bottle glass, I think we've got some of that. Just sort of abstract, mostly designs here in the capitals, but these capitals are inhabited. That's the official term for when you have actual scenes. And I'm not sure, yeah, well, maybe you can just see. That's, trust me on this, that's Adam and Eve being thrown out of paradise. That is, you can see somebody boinking somebody on the head there. That's Cain killing Abel, with other bits of their legend in behind them. And that's Noah. And if you know the story of Noah, he's the man in the flood who survives the flood with his family and all the animals 2 by 2. And the minute he hits dry land, I mean, he's the guy with the second chance, because, you know, the rest of the world was destroyed except for him and his immediate family. And still, the first thing he does is to go out and grow himself a nice vineyard, get some grapes, make wine, get drunk. Because he's human and he's stupid and he's weak. So this is him, his poor son, he has sons and they're embarrassed by their father lying in the ditch, so they're covering his nakedness. Oh, there's old dad in the ditch again. So that's just shows, these are the sort of ideas of sin before, you know, without all of this stupidity going on here, there's no need for this guy over here. So it's all sort of boils back down to Adam and Eve's fault, and then, because Noah is sort of the second chance guy, he still screws up. So, I mean, there's just a ton of stuff. I think part of the problem is that nowadays, first of all, we're all attention deficit, so when you see a picture like this in a gallery, did I mention this? The average viewing time would be about 4.3 seconds, I think it is, for 2.6 seconds is reading the label. And you can't, I mean, it took probably a year to paint this, so you can hang around for a little bit longer. But the more we've become sort of verbally literate, looking for words everywhere, the more we've become visually illiterate. You have to keep remembering that although this was painted for Nicholas Rolat, who could read and write, 93% of the people couldn't. Churchmen, probably most even kings, couldn't read and write. You had people to do that for you. Why would you bother? It takes a long time to learn how to read and write. So a lot of these are, again, the sort of visual aids to help put particularly the Christian stories out to the general public. Particularly the larger, this is obviously small for private worship in your own house. So not that many people would have got to see it, which is a bit unfortunate in some ways. But that, I mean, you're trying to communicate. So, you know, what you have to, actually there is it's called the Harvard method, I think. And what you do is you sort of take it inch by inch almost. So you start up here and you look down there and you take an inch and then you take another inch and look down there. Then you take another, and then once you get over to here, you probably still missed a couple of bits. So you start and you do it this way. You do it sort of horizontal. And you just make your eye create a sort of grid pattern. And then you'll still miss stuff. I mean, I still think that every time you go in, you'll find something new and interesting and different to look at in the picture. Nice floor as well. And look at the bejeweled hem of her robe. I mean, see, I don't know. I mean, I've never bothered to measure, but it looks quite accurate. I mean, as if you know, orthogonals for actual perspective. Nah, it'd be too boring to look at that, really, because it appears to be a more kind of satisfying sense of interior space than some of the other ones that he does. Anyway, that's that one, which is pretty amazing. Now, see, there's huge arguments about whether or not this is the same baby, maybe a year later. I mean, don't all babies look exactly the same anyway, so isn't it a bit futile? And this one's even less Jewish than that one somehow, but without going into too many specific details. But he's, again, very curly blonde, or almost silvery hair. And he is the one. This is the one again I showed you briefly in the first session. Just